You might have thought you were done with grammar when you graduated from your 8th grade English class, but I have to tell you that grammar is very important. In fact, the difference between a comma or a period makes all the difference in the world. Every once in a while, you might come across something where a comma is missing or a period is missing, and it can change the meaning of a sentence in a pretty funny way. There's a magazine called Tales, which is all about, it says, celebrating the relationship between pets and their people. And on one episode, Rachel Ray, the celebrity cook, was on the cover in a field of reeds, holding her dog, a boxer, smiling at the camera, and the caption said, "Rachel Ray finds inspiration from cooking her family and her friends." No commas. And I think that might explain why the dog looked so terrified and ready to get out of there. Put a comma in there, it changes everything. These examples are so good, I got to share a couple more. The second thing that I saw was a Goodwill right near the donation center. They had a sign, and on the sign it said, "Thanks!" exclamation mark. Your donation has helped someone, period. Get a job. Probably shouldn't have put that period in there. It comes off a little more condemning than encouraging and thankful. But there's also ways that if you take the same exact words, change the punctuation a little bit, it can change something that sounds loving, heartwarming, welcoming, and inviting into something that's maybe a little sinister and condemning. I want to read 2 Dear John letters to you. First, Dear John, I want a man who knows what love is all about. You are generous, kind, thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined men for me. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we're apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Gloria? Or, on the other hand, the exact same words. Dear John, I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men I yearn. For you I have no feelings whatsoever. When we're apart, I can forever be happy. Will you let me be yours, Gloria? Same words, different commas, different periods, different message entirely. Grammar makes a big difference. Now here's where that comes into play for us. A lot of times in life, where God intends a comma, we experience a period. See, we don't know everything. We're missing a lot of key information. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what others are thinking. We don't know what God's up to. And when we despair, when we lack faith, we experience things as a period, God's final word. He's done with us. But God might intend it to be a comma. I think it's especially relevant for us today, and it's especially relevant when Paul wrote this letter to the church in Philippi. Remember, if you listened to our sermon last week, we introduced this letter to the Philippians, where Paul, near the end of his life in prison, was writing to this church that he loves in Philippi. They're also facing some challenge. In verses 3 through 11 of chapter 1, Paul shares the thanks that he gives to God for this group of people. And he shares with them his prayer for them. And it's an incredible passage that is filled with warmth and love. And you can tell how much Paul cares for this group of people in Philippi. The passage is filled with words like thanks, joy, longing. He talks about love. He talks about affection. All of these words, and this whole period is actually, this section is longer than most of those in his other passages. He loves this church, and they fill him with joy. Joy comes from love. We experience joy when we think about those people that we love. Like Paul says, every time I remember you in all my prayers, I pray with joy. When we're with someone that we care about, when they're present or something good happens to them, we feel this sense of joy. And a lot of times it doesn't matter really what's going on, what we're doing. If you're married or maybe you're dating someone or just a friend, you can think about the things that you enjoy doing with those people, and often it's something really simple or basic. Just taking a walk, maybe even doing work. It's because there's something deep that connects you. The word that Paul uses here in verse 5 is because of their partnership in the gospel. Now, the word that's translated partnership is really a rich word in Greek, and the meaning of it can't fully be conveyed really in one English word. It's a word that we often hear translated throughout the New Testament as fellowship. Now, on one really basic level, what the word speaks to is camaraderie, fellowship, common interest. If you keep moving up the chain, it also speaks of a partnership, a joining together, even sharing financial burdens with one another. And finally, at its highest end, what it speaks to is even a unity, a bonding together of one with another. And it's out of this experience that this great joy comes. The word Paul uses here is partnership. And I wonder if you've thought of others in our church or as your friends or family as partners with you. We often think of the common interests or beliefs that we have, but do you think about the fact that we're all invested together with one another? What would that change if we began to think like that? It's this that brings joy. It also speaks of why and how we can experience joy even in a difficult situation. Why is it that we love looking at old photo albums? One of the things that's really popular now is posting pictures of things you've built or things that you've cooked or that you're about to eat. But when you look back at old photos, it's not the picture of the pasta that you were about to eat that brings you joy, but it's the faces of the people that you were with. You can even look at pictures where you're in the office of a failed business, but you're with someone that you love and it brings you joy, even though that may have been an incredibly difficult time. It's that joy that comes from being with one another, which also speaks to why what we're going through now is so difficult. Because when we're separated from those whom we love, or when something negative or harmful happens to someone we love, it doesn't bring joy, it brings sorrow. What's so painful now is not just the things that we're missing out on, not just the things that we're afraid of, like getting sick, but more than that, what we're not a part of. We're not able to go visit our loved ones who are in nursing homes or in the hospital. A new grandchild is born, and you can't go see it and hold that child in your arms for the first time. Graduation is missing. We can't be with one another. And I'm thankful for the technology that we have now so we can do these things online. Thankful for things like Zoom and Google Meet and all sorts of video conferencing where we can see one another face to face, but we can't look one another in the eye. We can look at the picture of their eyes, but we can't look in their eyes. We can't touch them. It falls short of what we're created for, this belonging, this being with one another. And it's all of those things that make this period, this time, feel like a period. This is it. And not only this time, but any time that we go through a difficult thing. You know, all the difficulty that we're experiencing now is because it's compounded. There's sickness, death, loss of job and finances, alienation and loneliness. All those are piled in, but we experience those all the time. And when we do, we feel like it's a period. This is the end of the story, and this is how it will always be. We look at our circumstances and we conclude we're alone, God's left us, it's over. And yet, Paul was also experiencing this in a prison cell, alone, near the end of his life. And those that he's writing to were also experiencing their share of opposition and struggle, their own suffering, as Paul will later talk about. And this passage isn't colored with depression and despair and worry. Instead, it's filled with joy and love and hope. How? In other words, how can Paul look at this, what he's going through, what the Philippians are going through, and not see a period, but see a comma, see something more? One of the ideas that's in here that comes out through phrases like this, your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, until the end. Who began a good work and who will complete it. An idea that this brings up is this idea of perseverance. Of perseverance when things get tough. How do we get through it? How do we keep going on? And when we think of perseverance, typically, we think of things like courage. We think of doing difficult things even when it's hard. We think of being courageous even when there's opposition. We think of perseverance as this motivation, this digging deep, finding the resources we have, and lifting ourselves out of the muck. Self-reliance. We go into a gym and we don't want to exercise and we look at these motivational posters of all these people working really hard and sweating. We don't want to keep working and trying to provide, and so we watch these videos of people who created their own business and pulled them up from their bootstraps. We don't want to despair in our sickness, and so we watch videos of people who overcame cancer and fought through it, never giving up. And we think to ourselves, maybe we have those resources in ourselves to continue from the first day to the last, to take what was begun and complete it. But all those motivators and self-reliance actually end up being a little bit judgmental, leading us to self-condemnation. The human spirit is great, but if that's all that we have, I don't know what that leaves us with. The Onion is a website I like to check out every once in a while. It's a satirical newspaper, and a lot of times their headlines have some incredible wisdom in them. One of the headlines that grabbed my attention recently said this: "Man not sure why he thought the most psychologically taxing situation of his life would be the thing to make him productive." The article talks about this man who said, I should have known that when the hardest thing I've ever gone through, going on furlough from my job, would not be the motivation I needed to finish my first great novel, to start exercising, and to eat healthy. And at the end of the article, it says, he's resigned himself to just feeling guilty over his lack of production. I think that's where we end up when we rely on ourselves to get us out of the period. That's not what gives Paul confidence. As Paul writes in verses 7 and 8, he mentions for the first time in this letter something about his situation. It's very brief, but he talks about the fact that he's in chains. And what he does when he mentions his circumstances is he actually separates those from God's work of advancing the gospel. He mentions that whether I'm in chains or defending and confirming the gospel. He separates actually his circumstances from what God is doing. And in fact, he doesn't say that he in chains needs defending, but it's the gospel that's defended and confirmed. Paul's doing something significant in a few phrases. What he's saying is that his experience, his circumstances don't give him the evidence he needs or that help him accurately understand what's going on. It doesn't give him the evidence he needs to know whether God's project, God's work is succeeding or failing. Because ultimately, it's not up to him and his resources, but it's up to God. In other words, what Paul's saying is, don't interpret the gospel through the lens of your experience. Rather, interpret your experience through the lens of the gospel. When Paul says that he can be confident, he can be filled with joy, he can be filled with thanks, it's not because of what's going on in his life. It's not because of what's going on in the Philippians' life, but it's because of God's faithfulness. He says that he is confident that he who began a good work in you, that is God, God's the one who started all this. God's the one who planted the seed, who's making it grow, who's bringing it to fruition. He who began a good work is also the one who will bring it to completion. God is faithful, and he doesn't start something that he won't finish. And so perseverance, getting through this time that feels like a period, isn't about our own resources, but it's about the faithful God who sent his Son to die on the cross and to rise from the grave and to send his Spirit to indwell us. So it's about waiting on him. It's about crying out to God when we're in distress. It's about trusting in God when we cannot do it on our own. It's about hoping in God for deliverance. Perseverance that's distinctively Christian looks like Joseph in prison for years, sold by his brothers, but knowing that God is faithful and loving and can bring good out of what others intended for evil. It's like Job, afflicted and ooze, suffering, loss, and yet knowing that his suffering is not because God's punishing him for his sin. It's not because God has abandoned him. But that maybe there are things going on that he doesn't understand. It's even like Jesus on the cross, innocent, suffering for our sins, and yet who calls out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is the evidence that Paul looks at, that allows him to be confident that this experience that we think of as a period, God intends to be a comma. Because God is the one who begins a good work and who brings it to completion. See, anytime we concentrate all of our focus on ourselves and our circumstances, or even on the circumstances of other people, that's bound to lead to anxiety, worry, fear. Have you ever had the experience where you come in to the home or come in and you see someone, you say, hello, hey, how are you doing? And they go, ugh, not so good. Or maybe they don't greet you with the energy and enthusiasm that you hope for. And you think in your mind, what did I do? They must be really upset at me. I must have offended them deeply. I'm a failure. I'm worthless. I'm nothing. And you start stressing out about all of these things. And it has nothing to do with you. They had a bad day at work, and they're thinking about it. They ate a bad taco. It was too greasy, and they have indigestion. When we don't have the evidence, we connect the dots in a really pathological way. When we look at ourselves, we become anxious and worried and fearful. And so Paul says, don't do that. Don't look at yourself. Look at him who began a good work in you. It's as if he's saying, however great your sins are, God is greater. However deep your affliction is, God is greater. However anxious you are, God is greater. He who began a good work in you will certainly bring it to completion. What we view as a period, God intends as a comma, which makes me wonder, what's the next part of the story? What comes after the comma? What's the second clause that we're to experience? We obviously can't answer those questions with lots of details. We don't know what tomorrow has, what the next week, what the next month. But Paul does point us to the very end of the story. And it's not that God's abandoned us, it's not that God's through with us, but it's this incredible prayer. That your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. Paul looks to the end of the story, to the day of Christ. A day that's not filled with gloom and despair and destruction, but that's filled with joy and hope and glory and praise. That sees us imperfect, sinful, as pure and blameless. It speaks of the fact that God is doing work in us that's transforming us, even now. Even if we don't feel like it, even if we don't really want to be changed in some of these ways. God is transforming us to be these pure and blameless people, not through our hard work, but through His grace, through Christ present in us. A love that's abounding more and more, that's richer and deeper, and that's filled with this knowledge and depth of insight, discerning what is best, so that we may be pure and blameless, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ. You see, that's the end of the sentence. Not now. The end is God's work. He's not through with us. This time won't last forever. The next hard time that we experience won't last forever. God will not abandon us. We're not alone. That's good grammar. Let's not put commas. Let's not put periods where God intends commas. Let's persevere by looking to Christ, who gave Himself for us, who loves us, who is continually working in us. And may that fill us with a joy and a love that brings glory and praise to God. Amen.